actually, let's wait for the recording. So this piece on microbiopolitics has been really key as I've sort of navigated the pandemic. It's really overdue that we sort of took some time to discuss it. So thank you, Heather, and it's a real delight to have you. And maybe for those of you who aren't familiar even with the idiom of biopolitics, if you could maybe just slow down a little bit and sort of bring everyone up to speed. In this piece, you talk about the moves that you were doing vis-a-vis Latour and vis-a-vis Foucault. So maybe, you know, just if you could introduce the idea, and because it's an interdisciplinary group. Some people are scientists here.
Okay, great. And Stefan can also join in on this too, because he was my co-conspirator with the microbiopolitical. So yeah, I mean, it's not even a neologism, right? It's just it's a smash, and smashing together of the biopolitical and what Latour investigated in pasteurization of France, you know, decades ago. Just recognizing that our social lives are threaded through these microbial worlds in ways that we are, or some of us are acutely aware of in some moments and utterly oblivious to in other moments. But regardless of how conscious we are of it, they're there, they're doing their thing. And part of what we do socially is, and our economy and our sociality is dependent upon our being able to live with some of those microorganisms, right? You know, as Latour showed, you know, we wouldn't have beer, we wouldn't have cheese, like we wouldn't have all sorts of things without them. We certainly have no aspirations to actually live in an antiseptic world, although, you know, at least when I was writing that was a very prevalent discourse, right? Certainly in the United States, with cleanliness and purity. This is nothing new, right? But just really trying to bring to light, to surface these underlying tensions, but also synergies between human worlds and microbial worlds. And, you know, obviously I came to it through cheese and through thinking about the craft of artisan cheese making and how they talked about skill in that. And a lot of it had to do with, you know, they wouldn't have so much talked about microbes per se earlier on, but they would talk about nature, right? And the agencies of milk and fermentation and things happening on their own. And so anyway, the microbiopolitics phrase, I just have to nod to Stefan again, who's going to wave there, who's speaking to us from downstairs, the same house that I'm in, just full disclosure. But he and I, the word, the concept, whatever, our use of that comes originally from a 4S panel that we organized in 2004 when it was in Paris. And we basically just wanted to go to Paris. And we're like, okay, you're working on oceans, I'm working with cheesemakers, or just beginning to. Like, what do we have in common? Microbes. So that is really where that comes from, is trying to put together a panel abstract that we could both give papers on. I'm just being honest, this is how this stuff happens sometimes, right? And then the more we started working with that concept, or at least the more I started working with that concept, Stefan sort of moved over to symbiopolitics and like did other sort of curlicues with it. But for me, it turned out to be really very generative. And that paper, that conference paper, predated actually most of the field work I did. So it really was sort of a framing thing. And then, you know, obviously it was not a simple story. So then it sort of spins out from there. But that's sort of, that were, yeah. So it's been a while.
And for me, the key sentence of this piece has always been on page 119. Microbiopolitical heroes and villains are not ontological designations, but are to be judged on the basis of situated, contingent action and effect. So I'd love to hear you just say more about that sentence. And you know, in the book, obviously, you talk about some of this judging, how the microbes are situated and what kinds of actions and effects, manifest in the world. But yeah, if you could just kind of talk about that, because I think and I must say I've got my post-Pasteurian shirt on here.
So Evan was the model for that photo.
So yeah, I mean, obviously this has been taken up in sort of popular culture in a different kind of way, and more of a way that microbes are good. Why should we kill them? But how are these judgments being made? And maybe in the last year you've lived through a pandemic. What kinds of microbiopolitical judgments have you seen all around you?
Well, I think one of the main things that I'm pointing to in that, and I have seen at least early in the pandemic, is maybe not so much what the judgments are, but are a sort of reflexive all or nothing judgment, right? Of extreme judgments, of lumping, of either making, very grand pronouncements, espousing a certain purity that's dependent on an antiseptic attitude on the one hand, and the other, as you say, the sort of lumping of all microbes as nature and therefore as good, either because they're part of God's creation and there absolutely is a religious thread through, or a basis to some of those discourses, or just a kind of anti-industrial, anti-modern sort of recuperation of some sort of before time that was happier or something, right? But in other words, just in either case, just sort of taking this category, which of course is not a natural category, right? Microbe is nothing other than something that you need a microscope to see, basically, and making a claim about beneficence or threat, sort of in a overgeneralized way. And it doesn't even have to be an argument. It can just be a reflexive attitude, right? I think a lot of it is about a certain revulsion about putrefaction on the one hand, or a certain reverence for, the wonders that fermentation can bring, and running from that. Now, this is for the most part not the people whose job it is, right, to make fermented foods. So I definitely want to start out by saying that, where I see the over-enthusiastic post-Pasteurian, promissory language, it's not the people who are making food to feed other people. It's more that some of their consumers or boosters, right? Because food makers certainly know, or if they don't, they get out of business pretty quickly. It's not a one size fits all kind of thing. But just briefly in terms of the pandemic, I gave a talk in the fall revisiting microbiopolitics, and it made me sort of slow down and think about it. And I was reminded of, I'm sure many of you saw that video that circulated on social media, and it was on, CNN and stuff, of that. It was a family physician from somewhere in the upper Midwest who put scrubs on and in his kitchen, demonstrated how to sanitize your groceries, right? And he had masking tape lying on his kitchen counter and had, here's the bag of groceries coming home and how you sanitize and you repackage and you put it on the sanitary side of the whole thing about like sanitizing. Like, there was just something, I watched that video, I'm like, that can't be right. Like, there was just something that really bothered me about it, and I couldn't really figure it out, because it was the beginning of the pandemic and I wasn't really thinking straight. And then later I did see a commentary by a microbiologist who was like, this is an airborne virus. It's not foodborne at all, and it just doesn't work that way. And so again, I think that was just an example of how we just think microbe, okay, like just sort of put it all in the same microbial pot, right, or an envelope or something. But a foodborne, like an airborne virus and a foodborne bacteria, just don't behave the same way, right? And our cautions in terms of not, being exposed to it or contaminated by it are going to be very different. So our exposure to coronavirus, insofar as food and eating are actually germane to it, it's not because we're going to ingest it through food. It's because we often eat with other people, or at least we used to, right? So the risk of food with coronavirus is that we come close to each other without masks on. It's conviviality, right? It's commensality is the risk. It's not actually, food susceptibility to microorganisms at all, or even surfaces.
I must admit, I was washing my groceries along with the best of them for a few weeks.
I mean, to be sure, we didn't really understand that the fomites weren't really a concern, right? That it really was an aerosolized situation. But even so, I think many of us didn't even stop to think, like, is this a parsing that we, are we missing something here? We're just like.
And yeah, as usual, everyone, feel free to put questions in the chat or unmute yourself. In hearing you talk about this, I was also just wondering, where does the anti-vaxxer community fit? I mean, in any of the, I don't know how much you're still in touch with some of these cheesemakers or people who are eating the cheeses, but I could imagine a heroic post-Pasteurian could be a very enthusiastic anti-vaxxer.
Anti-vaxxer, yeah. I mean, there definitely are. Not among the people that I knew well, but these businesses actually have all gone out of business as far as I know. But there were some very, I would say, libertarian fringe. This is being recorded. I think that's okay to say.
You don't want to be, you're going to be targeted by Anonymous next.
There was a business, a cheese making business, farmstead in the Pacific Northwest. I never met them. It was part of the country I didn't do field work in. But the cheeses were very celebrated. She was very talented. There was an outbreak of listeriosis and investigation and blah, blah, blah. And her initial response was to post on her blog these like pretty intense, I will call them screeds against anti-government screeds. And they came down really quickly. It was clear that her lawyer told her to take them down. But they were very revealing insofar as it was very anti-government. It was very there were some,
millenarian.
Thank you. and I don't know if there was anything like about the vaccinations in there, but it was familiar, right? That kind of discourse. Certainly among consumers, right? I think raw milk cheeses attract, there's a very complicated Venn diagram, right? Of people who are attracted to or find value in raw milk cheese above and beyond taste. And there's certainly a Venn diagram intersection with an anti-vaxxer situation. One of the raw milk activists who's in New York, she's not rural at all, is also somebody who's written about vaccination and autism. So I know that rhetorically that there are connections there. But like I said, in terms of, I think the cheese makers themselves who are enduring, not so much.
And I think that slippage is interesting. I mean, on the one hand, microbiopolitics is against the one size fits all biopolitics of the FDA, sterilize everything, and
or the post-Pasteurian most.
Right. Yeah. And I think what the piece is describing, and what the book is describing, is ways of doing microbiopolitics that are an alternative to that kind of state-supported, mode of managing life and death of others. And yeah, we were also thinking of your ideas earlier on. Rob Dunn and Salas Ariola were talking about kind of the impulse to bake sourdough bread during the pandemic. So, you know, at the same time, we're all kind of, you know, uncertain about what kinds of new ontologies we need to perform as we receive groceries, for example. You know, there was, I think, a real enthusiasm for, you know, the good microbes, even, you know, maybe as folks were baking that bread, not necessarily thinking in those terms of, you know, situated effect and action.
Right. I confess I had a stint at the sourdough bread in the last winter. It didn't last through the summer. But for me, it was not about the microbes. It was just, I had time, right? I was home. I had never done it before because I could never guarantee that I would be home for, you know, weeks on end. But it's a different kind of discipline.
And maybe just one ethnographic question. We've paired your essay this week with one that came up when we were discussing Roberta Raffieta's allied work, and it's an essay. I think Nina found this while we were discussing it, and it talks about bacteriophages as unexpected allies in the dairy industry.
Yeah.
So ethnographically, have you heard people in the dairy industry talking about phage? And
yeah, this was really interesting to see. I skimmed it earlier today. Well, one thing is, and this is actually a little bit of a correction to the 2008 cultural anthropology article, but when I talk about David Major for making Vermont Shepherd cheese, he would rotate. He used a commercial strain of bacteria starter cultures, and he would rotate different numbers, right? different strains or different strain mixes. But he had every few weeks, he would change it up to rotate it. And what I sort of misattributed the rationale for that in that early article. And really what he was doing was preventing the buildup of bacteriophage. Right, so that is definitely something that's well known and very common practice for artisan cheesemakers to keep the community of starter cultures diverse, to prevent that buildup, as they say, in terms of avoiding them. The last half of the essay, when they're talking about bacteriophage as ally, you know, that's sort of interesting because, you know, those are very industrial applications, right? Spraying the cheese with anti-microbials is what they're talking about, right? So I have definitely seen presentations at dairy industry conferences, and I have a whole stack of brochures in my office, which I'm not at right now, of ads for these commercial products. So it's actually very highly commercialized and highly industrialized. And I don't know of any artisan makers who use them, but I have seen them in the industry. I don't know if Matt, I don't know if you're familiar. Maybe there are artisan applications of the phage and the antimicrobial.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I think I also never heard of any kind of artisanal cheesemakers using them. But what I find really interesting in what that article is completely omitting is that the reason why I think they are not really used in, let's say, kind of Alpine European cheese making systems, where often people use backslopping cultures, is because the diversity is already in the culture.
Exactly.
So there is no phage buildup because whenever there is a phage infection, there is other strains who bounce back and who will. And as we know, phages are so specific, often not even to species, but to strains. So there is no real need for that. But I also found that interesting too, and I'll definitely ask around if people are using that maybe in the aging room. I guess especially listeria is mostly a problem in the aging room. So, but yeah, I'd be surprised.
I've seen it. Yeah, I've seen it recommended, and I've seen cheesemakers scoff at the recommendation.
So Caitlin, you get a shout out in the essay. Do you want to talk about how microbiopolitics figured in your own work? So early on in the pandemic, Caitlin talked about her work with the reading group, particularly in this moment where a lot of us were just coming to terms with the lack of conviviality. So Heather, we're talking about, it's not FOMO, it's conviviality. And
yeah.
Do you want to jump in, Caitlin?
Oh my gosh, I feel a little bit put on the
On the
spot.
spot.
Other than to say that, yeah, of course, like in the latest essay that I wrote, and in the first one around life cycle of a common weed, Heather's work with microbiopolitics is in both of them because of the way that it really puts together these tensions of what like that it's not all harmony, and the decisions have to be made, and actually I don't know, I was trying to formulate sort of things that are on my mind at the moment with microbiopolitics, and in hearing from you, maybe a little bit around framing things, the way that people are framing things as being in right relation, and feeling that that is an insufficient kind of framework for especially talking about microbiopolitics in the many realms that your work touches on. And so I'm wondering if you might have some ways of navigating maybe how that can be a bit reductive, especially when it comes to microbes, because sometimes the microbes can be so essential in some contexts, and then at different scales they're completely harmful to in an ecological environment. And so really scale has so much to do with it also. So yeah, maybe to start there. First surprise on the spot question.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is again one of those a category problem in a sense. Like when we're talking about microbes, what are we talking about? We're talking about one microbe? I don't know. Are we talking about a small amount? Are we talking about a massive amount? Right? Just in terms of thinking about food safety, this is something that I, take from the nutritionist Marion Nestle, and she says it so clearly, and it's so fundamentally important. But when we're talking about food safety, food safety doesn't inhere in a food. A food is not inherently safe, right? Food safety is a relation between not a category of food, but a particular instance of food, like this piece of food right now in this condition today, not tomorrow, not yesterday, right? And the capacity of an eater, a particular eater, to digest and absorb and to be okay with that piece of food and whatever microorganisms are attached to it. So that radical contingency of food safety does make it very challenging to regulate, right? It makes it's an incredibly challenging puzzle. And food safety regulation around cheese is even more challenging and fun in terms of classification, because what's cheese? Right? Cheese types are so radically different as microbial environments, right? As susceptible to particular microorganisms. So Matt was saying that Listeria monocytogenes, it's not a very common cause of foodborne illness, but it's incredibly pathogenic. I think that the death rate is, I don't know, it's massive. It's like close to a third or something. I don't know, I'm terrible with numbers. I always have to look these things up, but it's bad, right? It's bad. If you get it, it's bad. And it's the cheeses that are really susceptible to being colonized by Listeria monocytogenes are these high moisture, low acidity cheeses like brie, right? And so a lot of regulations are about trying to prevent that, but they use categories like soft, like what counts as a soft cheese as opposed to a hard cheese, right? So, you know, I've played with this in a different paper, or maybe somewhat in that paper, but the categories that we use culinarily in terms of types that producers use, because there are different types of recipes, versus the regulators thinking about pathogenic, you know, susceptibility, those categories don't actually match up, right? So it's a very challenging thing to try to think about regulating, in part because it's not one food, right? We call it cheese, but that's I was even part of a conversation that the Society for, what is it? The American Microbiological Society, I think that's what it's called. They convened a meeting in DC, I don't know, half a dozen years ago, to come up with an FAQ pamphlet. They have a whole series of FAQs on their website about cheese and microbes. So I was invited as the resident anthropologist of cheese, and some of the people I write about actually including in that article, and the cheese man was there, right? Noelle Marcelino was there, and Rachel Dutton, and all these people were there. And we had a whole day discussion to like come up with this FAQ, sort of explaining about the role of microbes in cheese. And we spent a whole bunch of time just debating what counted as cheese. Like, do we include paneer in this, which is actually not fermented, right? And so it really, all these cheese experts, we had to like do a lot of compromising, even decide what the cutoff should be for talking about cheese and microbes, let alone talking about the role of pasteurization. So anyway, I'm totally rambling now, but radical contingency, right? and yeah, and these relative categories. I mean, that's what I think is interesting about this as an anthropologist, in part, is it's all about classification, right? And the messiness of that.
I suppose there's really radical epistemological things going on here too. I mean, with the pasteurization, it's a doing, right? It's you do this, and then kind of that whole world of microbial life disappears. But with the post-Pasteurian microbiopolitics, like maybe if you could say more just about the onto-epistemological challenges when one is dealing with, I think maybe what makes microbiopolitics so tough to sort of enact is just sort of knowing what's there and knowing how to respond, even when you know the ways of so if it's about the judged on the basis of situated, contingent, action, and effect, like how do you perceive, you know, who's there to begin with, and as a consequence, you know, what to do?
Well, the cheesemakers don't need to know, right? I mean, they've been making cheese way before. I mean, these recipes and the techniques totally predate. Well, they predate even, you know, obviously often Pasteur, and even recognizing that microbes are there, but they certainly predate any kind of close assay of who's there, right? So they don't respond to microbes per se, but they respond to temperature and time and humidity and you know, what the milk is doing. And the milk is not just microbial, but it's enzymes and it's all these, you know, fat content, blah, blah, blah. It's, yeah, so they don't need to know anything about the microbes. I think what surprised some of the microbiologists who started working with cheesemakers and looking into it more, like Rachel Dutton and Ben Wolf, is how many of the cheesemakers actually got really excited about learning about the microbes. And that really added to their sense of, first of all, appreciation for what the milk and the curd were doing, that they were trying to keep up with, but also, a sense of appreciation for being part of a process that was a little bit beyond their full comprehension. And it added not necessarily mastery, but wonder. So that's what I thought was sort of cool.
In the piece, you talk about Momofuku and this attempt to do that work of identification, and
Right.
since then we have Josh Evans and doing the work in Copenhagen with Noma, and I'm wondering how much of this has become a thing, and are more and more restaurants or chefs or connoisseurs trying to get in the business of identifying like the tasty microbes that add to the terroir.
Yeah, I mean, as we're seeing, they're still doing it, right? We still see these sorts of experiments, and I'm sure there's stuff with beer. I'm sure there's stuff with harvesting ancient yeasts and things like this. And I think that the appeal is again part probably craft experimentation, right? Probably somewhat about claims of locality, local goodness, that kind of reverse engineering terroir, to try to brand a place as a particularly beneficent, or that's not exactly the right word, but just trying to say something other than good, a good place to make food, right? I think there's stories, right? I think that the microbes provide narrative fodder for telling stories about the virtues of slow production, right? Of artisan techniques and things like this, of paying attention to place and local ingredients and things. I'm not entirely convinced that there's any way of getting at. I mean, microbes don't taste in and of themselves, right? They reveal flavors that are in fats and and so forth. So yeah, I think that they're pretty powerful narrative devices, and it's interesting to think about why that is. What does it tell us about our moment that is exciting to some people? Yeah. So I think they'll continue to be narrative devices, but I think the stories that they'll be used to tell will probably continue to proliferate. Oh, I see things popping up.
Perry Pasteurian, do you want to ask your questions, Savi?
Oh, Perry Pasteurian.
It was your suggestion, actually, Heather. I asked this question when you were giving talk in Cambridge about post-Pasteurian, because it doesn't somehow, as you explained, correspond with all other practices which have been somehow still practiced before Pasteur himself. So you yourself suggest this Pasteurian. So at that, it was just short answer, and I would like to hear more about that. Do you remember? I don't know.
I do remember. Thank you. So yeah, this was a question from a talk I did in the fall, and I think I'd like to hear more from you actually about what you have in mind. So I think what I was suggesting is that post-Pasteurian is not a return to the pre-Pasteurian, because it's very, very cognizant of hygiene, right? And of what we learned from pasteurization and from the threat of not only pathogens but phages and things like this that thwart desired fermentation and so forth. So it's very much cognizant of that kind of public health scientific knowledge. So why don't you tell us more about what you had in mind behind that question about how to think about what a pre
yeah, because I am somehow interested in yogurt practices in Bulgaria and Turkey.
Okay,
and
right.
When I'm doing my ethnographic research, which quite inspiring by your work as well. So, but they don't know about this kind of scientific things, but you were somehow some of your artisan cheesemakers do. So they had somehow different understanding, and still they are somehow applying the knowledge they somehow have there from their generations past by generations. So I was asking, is still your approach applied to them or not? Yeah, it was still, I'm still thinking about that.
Well, I would say what would apply would be thinking about artisanship, right? Of working in a customary set of practices in a way that's reflexive with the materials at hand, that responds to the materials, right? You don't have to have any sense of a microbial component to that material to know that, you know, you might have to adjust your recipe depending on season or whatever. I don't actually know anything about yogurt making, but I would say that there's, yeah, post-Pasteurian, probably, maybe not, right?
So
Thank you.
Amina has a question in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and ask that about the religious dimensions?
Sure. Thank you, Heather. And also any number of you, Stefan, your work, the both of you in particular, was really influential for me in my dissertation work. And it's fun to see your faces. And yeah, so thank you. I do religious studies and microbial life, to essentialize all of it for a moment. I'd be interested to hear you talk more about the religious aspects, both positively and negatively, of the ways microbial life is informing or is being deformed by religious perspectives on either germs, COVID, or even as it relates to anti-vaxxing, and maybe to be a little bit more specific, my own work began in thinking about observing the use of Purell at Eucharistic tables, at the serving of the bread and the wine, and how it becomes like a third element that in many ways deforms at this really imaginative moment this Christian religious perspective on the goodness of creation and the inclusivity of non-human creatures. But as I began to write that work, I kept pressing up against all these ways that Pasteurianism or germ theory was completely entwined with a modern way of thinking about what it means to be a human before God in the Christian tradition, as well as getting, as well as the struggle that, you know, at one moment I have people clinging to their bottle of Purell at the Eucharistic table, and at another you have, you know, bishops in Cyprus clinging to their common spoon because Jesus and a microbe can't be in the same place at the same time. So I'm trying to open up a way to befriend microbes in this tradition at the same time that I have, you know, people at my dissertation committee saying, careful, this is starting to sound like an anti-vaxxer manifesto, right? So it's this strange line between, like you said, it's very contingent, the goodness or the badness or the beneficiality. So I'm just wondering what kinds of soundings you're hearing from religious communities about post-Pasteurianism.
Well, I'd love to hear more about your work. It sounds super fascinating. And I have to say, I did not study the religious dimensions directly at all. I mean, I kept my ears open for it, but it really was not something that I looked at systematically. You know, Sister, now Mother Noella Marcelino, I mean, she's just so charismatic, and she was happy to put herself out there. And when that documentary came out, I mean, I think that sort of became a little bit larger than life, but I mean, it might suggest that it was a stronger discourse that I encountered than it really was, just because she's such a persona. I would say though, to your committee, that it's just politically so inconsistent, which is fascinating. I mean, it's not at all a liberal conservative thing. I mean, I think it does map onto a libertarian. I think the signal might come more from people's relationships to the government than their relationships to the microbes, right? And that the microbial thing is almost epiphenomenal to stances vis-a-vis about government regulation per se, at least in as some way of understanding how the strange political bedfellows are so varied when it comes to these Pasteurian versus post-Pasteurian kinds of attitudes. They don't cash out politically in any neat way, which I think is a very instructive thing in general. But yeah, I just think that's so fascinating about the Purell and so that's just pandemic times, is that right?
No,
Or is it earlier too?
Earlier too.
Oh, wow.
About 5 or 6 years ago, I began working on that project, and the pandemic put a real wrench in the project, because here I am pushing against the use of this product that now
right.
many Christians haven't taken communion in a year because of a microbe. So it's a strange project for this moment. The work was really helpful because it helped me think in terms of a microbiopolitical theology, I guess.
Yeah.
But I saw all sorts of kind of religious significance in the way that you were writing about, the way you were writing about people's speech about microbes, from their evil to the innocent cheesemaker, and
true.
Have so much religious valence or moral.
Yeah, certainly moral, and that certainly has an old tradition in terms of thinking of the magic of fermentation, right, and the cunning of the cheese woman, the dairy woman who has a knack, right, for cheese, pre-modern kinds of discourses. I think cheese making and witchcraft have a historical connection. How do you explain the fact that some women have a knack for cheese and some women did not, right? And it could very well have been had to do with their microbiome or their more to the point, their proclivity towards hygiene, right? Not necessarily a moral cleanliness, but a practical cleanliness. But historically in the literature, cross-culturally, there are lots of associations along those dimensions. There's.
Lisette, do you want to jump in with a question?
I would actually just be really fascinated to hear you speak more about what you were saying with the witchcraft and the cheese making, because I don't know any of that history at all. And I think that's really interesting because it has to do with like the magic of transforming matter, right?
Yeah.
And then just as an aside, while you think about that, I have to say I was really fascinated. I've read the Multispecies Salon, so I was familiar with your work before this, but it makes me go back to milk, really. Of course.
Multi-species interruption. Lisette lives with raccoons amongst other things.
Raccoons.
But maybe do you want to start talking about witchcraft and then?
Well, it's just some of the historical background stuff that I read in writing the book. It's not something that I researched myself necessarily, but certainly in Puritan New England, there are tracts about I just sort of said, how did people explain how so cheese making was just something that women did as part of their chores, right? In Puritan New England. It was a way of preserving milk. It was an everyday thing. They did it for domestic use and for trade. And some of them made cheese that kept well and tasted all right, and other women just made cheese that blew up all the time. It's not an easy thing to make cheese well consistently, right? And so, you know, witchcraft was, or just, you know, purity and malevolence and all those sorts of sort of a mystical worldview was part of how some of the inexplicable was explained. Yeah, women's cunning. I mean, there's just historical associations. And then in the ethnographic literature in Europe, there are further sorts of associations along some of those lines as well. But it's not something that I studied directly myself. Although I did, you know, encounter people who would use magical thinking or use the language of magical thinking sometimes to talk about how they cared for their cheese, tended their cheese. There were a lot of things that they themselves would call superstitions. I talked to a woman who said that she never went into the cheese house when she was in a bad mood. She was, you know, didn't want to deleteriously affect the cheeses that they were developing. You know, I think some of this is playful, but like many playful things, it gets at maybe a gut feeling anyway that they have, that their life force is connected to the life force that they see in the cheeses that are developing and doing their own thing, or at least are experienced often as doing their own thing. Sometimes along the lines that you're coaxing, and sometimes despite all your best efforts, right? So yeah. Matt, I don't know if you've got better stories than I do, because you've got more recent field work.
Definitely not, but I was just, I mean, of course, there's lots of stories that I can think of. So first is our fieldwork in Mongolia, where milk is, of course, a very important substance and very important for just like for daily ritual practice. Like every morning, the woman of the house gets up and offers milk to the sky, to the four cardinal directions. But also, and that is not something that I experienced myself, because I didn't spend enough time there, but it's also very important for shamanistic practice. And so, and it's in a way kind of very important to go along the kind of the white line. And I think it seems, from what I heard from my Mongolian friends in Mongolia and ethnographers who work there, is that it's also kind of a very clear boundary against dark magic, that kind of you have to use milk in order to kind of to do the white good magic. And the other thing I had to think of was these weird old Swiss guys, and it's kind of in Switzerland, it's this really interesting example where most of the, especially like the summer pasture milk cheese making, where kind of most of the cheese was made traditionally in the summer pastures up in the mountains. And that has been, at least for, I think, since the 14th, 15th century, mostly men who did that work. And so sometimes you still met old farmers who were very skeptical about women making cheese. And sometimes you would hear stories like, well, there was this old farmer who said, well, you can't hire a woman cheesemaker because when she's menstruating, the milk won't curdle, or stuff like that. So that is definitely something there is also a lot of gender relations always in there.
Yeah. Thanks.
So Karina has there's a lot of interesting questions in the chat here, but I might elevate Karina's, because it's taking us in slightly different direction about geopolitics. Do you want to go ahead and ask that?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I haven't had enough coffee, but I'm thinking, so every time that sort of the virus pops out in Australia, or I think in different places of the world, there's the way in which mutations of the virus have come to be known as the UK strain or the South African strain, and then like a big bonanza, like now the Russian strain escaped, and then it's like we need a longer quarantine for this, or it's more, so there are all sorts of sort of attributes. And I mean, there was a big conversation about calling strains South African, or I'm South African, or like whatever, and sort of the connotations of that. And I mean, even from the beginning of this pandemic, I mean, one of the first things I thought of with the specifically around the Wuhan sort of discourse and the China virus discourse, was about that terroir and terror sort of idea and thinking in your, specifically in that reverse engineering piece. And I think so often about that. That moment, I think you were talking, about colonization and rape of the land, and how do you think about placemaking and terroir as a different kind of relation and the effects of that. So I guess I'm kind of just like riffing about these ideas, but I'm also trying to think about a way in which we can talk, or an analytic for thinking about how the virus has place-specific or location-specific connotations, and how we can deal with that analytically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm glad you brought that up. I think that it's such an unfortunate thing what's happening with the referring to these strains in terms of places, because of course what they're referring to is the place where they were first identified. It doesn't necessarily have to be their origin in any material sense at all, right? So like the UK is sort of being faulted for first identifying this more virulent, mutation, and instead of being, praised for calling it to our attention so that we can be on guard against it, it's stigmatized, right? Let alone, what there really have been horrible repercussions in the States, in particular, from Trump and his followers referring to it as the China virus, right? I mean, very, very well now documented exponential rise in violence against Asian Americans. So these things are really serious and they matter. In terms of the terroir discourse, in a different article, I talk about this a little bit, but in terms of thinking again about scale, one of the problems with using the rhetoric of terroir in a context like the United States, in this very sort of ahistorical way, is how it erases the history of land dispossession and land ownership and so forth, as if there's nothing in between the current farmer and the bedrock geology, right? Which is, of course, a problem. or just really naive. It's really naive and has the effect of contributing to a misperception about our regions and what makes our regions the places that they are, in terms of thinking about placemaking. So thank you, great question.
So I think Natalie's question kind of brings us back to some of the heart, the conundrum of microbiopolitics. The funny thing, bread and wine are fermented foods made by microbes, and then microbes are used and rejected at the same time. Now, Natalie, do you want to say anything about that? Or Heather, do you want to respond?
I'm waiting for Natalie first, if she wants to say anything.
Yes, it's because it's the same thing with microbiota. Because in fact we try to kill it, reject it. In the same time, we cannot live without, and that's why I think there is a really close relationship between the microbiota and, in a way, the macropolitics, because we have a conflict, a really big conflict with.
And again, there's a lot of naivete around that too. And since after, more recently than any of these publications, the regulatory politics are still ongoing in the States with regard to raw milk cheese and artisan cheese in general. And every few years, it seems like the FDA is gonna go after, it's not the FDA, it's like there's some inspectors somewhere who decide they're going to enforce a rule by looking at something that they hadn't really looked at or whatever. But I think there was actually a rule change a few years ago where they were gonna hold raw milk cheeses to the same threshold levels as pasteurized milk cheeses with regard to non-toxic, some indicator microbe that wasn't itself pathogenic, but could indicate that there could be pathogens. It was like a benign version of E. coli, right? Or not the toxigenic E. coli. And And the cheesemakers are like, you've got to be kidding. You know, raw milk cheese has stuff in it. That's what makes it cheese. And it was just really indicated a fundamental misunderstanding of what this fermented food is constituted by, right? What makes it what it is, to try to use the same standards for some non-toxic, non-pathogenic organism inside it that would be out of place in a pasteurized cheese, but not in a raw milk cheese, right? So they had to, like, you know, have a big letter writing campaign and get some senators involved, and they got the rule rescinded, but they had to do it. And this was like 5 years ago. This is not ages ago. So speaking exactly to that point, it is silly. It's silly kind of how much lack of understanding there is about the food that we eat, even by people whose job it is to keep us safe from it. All right, there's another one here.
I see lots of other questions. I've actually got to go to another chat as well. So I'll propose, I'll download the chats, I'll send them to you, Heather. Feel free to respond directly. And I also want to do a plug next week for Lindsay Ofrias. She's going to be talking to us about COVID in the Brazilian Amazon. She's produced a really interesting podcast. So instead of reading for next week, we've got a podcast for everyone to listen to. But thank you, Heather. This has been a super enlightening discussion. Thanks for sharing your latest political thoughts. And thanks everyone for the smart questions.
Yep, thanks.